anybody have any comments they want to make with respect to the TED Talk we just had you watch? All right, Shivani?
Yes, so I'm amazed that we are placed in like categories based on perceived values in order for some people to pay for stuff, like pay a higher price for stuff versus some paying a lesser price. So I think that is quite unfair to know that they do all of that, and I wasn't really aware of that. So that video basically educated me on those like target audience and so forth. So yeah.
Okay, and so what do you see as unfair?
So like they basically said that they place us in different categories, right? So if a person yes, so I'm saying that it's really unfair to know that, okay, some people will pay a lesser price for something versus another person will pay a higher price for something. So I'm saying that it's quite unfair, and I wasn't aware of all of that. So that's quite new to me.
Yeah, that's targeted marketing, right? And absolutely true. It's micro marketing, and it does exactly that. It accumulates the data that basically you've put online, Facebook and Instagram and all those kind of things, and then it pretty much puts you into a demographic, and then targets you as a member of that demographic. And for instance, iPhone or the Apple users tend to be, and this is very generic, but tend to be more well off than those who use Android devices. It's a more elitist. Some people see it as a more or as a better. They see it as a better product, and therefore they're prepared to pay more to participate with iPads and Macs and all those kind of things that are involved with Apple. And so, yeah, you get targeted and things cost more. So, and the evidence bears that out. Kate, you had your hand up?
Hi.
Okay.
I was going to touch on that, how I'm an Apple user and I didn't realize that I got charged more for some things. But also another thing, kind of like in the movie, how they talked about we can only save ourselves from the breaches of privacy by having a voice and bringing the issue to a head. So that was interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to talk about that some more tonight, particularly the second chapter 5, on exactly how to protect yourself from this kind of thing, data breaches and this kind of targeting. Carrie, you had your hands up?
I found it really interesting around the whole DNA collection there, and how the stereotyping and race, the accumulation of DNA of profiling race, especially in America, and how it doesn't necessarily have to have your own DNA there, but a family member's DNA. So, and I can't remember the percentages, but it was exorbitant amount of African Americans who were in that database, and therefore the targeting of crime investigations would be towards African Americans. And as well in the film around the analysis of brain imagery and that idea of thought control or thought police, and that the being predisposed to criminal behavior. It's going to be a very interesting future for us to try and discern, how we can use that type of technology in a way that's not infringing on one's right, just simply for having cognitive differences that are observable.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Two things. I'll go. The second thing I'll talk about first. The brain scans. That was kind of a creepy kind of thing that I had no idea about. But I can tell you because I did most of my doctorate in criminology at University of Ottawa. So in criminological research, 150 years ago, it was very, very common for law enforcement and those interested in assessing who would potentially commit crimes. It was very common to look at criminals based on the size of their forehead, their ears. Basically, the thinking being that a small forehead means less brain brain pan, and and that was a very, very common criminological process. And this is just an extension of that to a great degree, looking at brain scans, although more sophisticated, and saying that this someone may or may not commit or will commit a crime based upon brain activity. That's a really interesting proposition, and until it's dispelled, as it was 150 years ago, based on the size of somebody's forehead, we'll have to wait and see. Right? It's really interesting. DNA is another whole thing that's obviously incredibly important in things like law enforcement. And Rosen, who did the TED Talk, talked about that a bit. It's the ability to collect DNA for the purposes of a data bank is different depending on where you are. So, for instance, if you are in the United Kingdom and you're arrested for a crime, you're not convicted, you're simply arrested, and the charges could be dropped in the future or what have you. Upon your arrest, your DNA is taken and put into a data bank, right? That's just the way the legislation is set up. In the U.S., it differs, based on, I mentioned this last day, there are 50 separate criminal justice basically systems, in each state, like one in each state. So, depending on where you are arrested or pulled over will depend on whether your DNA can be taken for the purposes of putting it into a data bank. Now, you would think that collecting DNA for these purposes would only be relevant, if you're looking to basically tie the DNA to a very specific crime that has been committed. Right, and that kind of makes sense. If you think that if the law enforcement thinks that a person has committed a crime and there's DNA at the scene of the crime, so and that only takes place in about 15% of all crimes, which basically involves there being some biologic evidence left at the scene. So it almost always involves a violent crime, murders and or sexual assaults, where in fact there's physical contact. So DNA is only a viable tool in a very, very small percentage of cases. But having said that, it's pretty easy to understand how, cops would want to have DNA if they actually had biological evidence at the scene of the crime and they wanted to tie it to somebody who they think is a suspect. So, getting that DNA, for the most part, if it isn't already provided for in whatever legislation the state already has, then it would require a warrant. And if they thought that they had somebody who was a good prospect for the crime, then they probably have pretty solid, reasonable, probable grounds to get a warrant for DNA. In Canada, totally different, right? In Canada, the criminal code sets out 4 fundamental categories of when DNA can be collected. Right now, again, it can still be collected with a warrant if there is a site-specific use for it to connect somebody to a exigent crime that's just taken place. But what our criminal code basically says is, depending upon the crime that you've been convicted for, as in you have to have been convicted of a crime. So DNA, unlike in England, is not taken automatically upon arrest, or a lot of the states. It only depends upon the nature of the crime. So for crimes that involve violence, homicides, and sexual assaults, then the first category of DNA collection, basically is automatic. You will end up giving, particularly if it's a sexual crime, you will have to give your DNA. And then the next category basically is you don't automatically have to give up your DNA, but if you're the accused, you have to convince the judge that you shouldn't have to give it up. The next category, and these are lesser offenses, you understand, it's a chain kind of thing. So the third category is where, in fact, you don't have to give DNA, and the Crown has to convince the judge that the person should give it, all right? And the fourth category is basically most offenses, because most offenses don't deal with personal assaults and what have you, where in fact, either party can make an application to basically keep it in or out. And so, it's the fourth category very seldom sees DNA collection of that, right? Not to identify somebody in a crime right now. The purpose of it, and it's always been argued by the chiefs of police for, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, is that, DNA should be collected as often as possible, because what they want to do is create a data bank. They want to have a data bank. So if a crime takes place this week and it involves biological evidence being captured at the scene of the crime, they want to be able to go to a data bank and say, John Smith, gave his sample 4 years ago, but guess what? It matches us now, right? So it's a detection tool that provides historical evidence for crimes that take place in the future, right? So that's how Canada approaches it. So it's pretty much a very unique system to how we address it. And again, the Canadian Association for the Chiefs of Police, they're always lobbying the federal government to basically add more and more crimes to the first two categories, where in fact the DNA is, absolutely must be taken, or more than likely will be taken, right? The accused has to argue against it. So, they're trying to get more and more crimes into those categories so that obviously the data bank for DNA is that much broader. Okay, so that's how it kind of works here. Val, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I kind of had a two-part question, and I guess the first part kind of ties into what you're talking about now first. In regards to collecting DNA, do you think it would get to the point where they would collect it at birth? Or is that an infringement on the rights that we have? I'm just not sure how that ties together for the first part.
Yeah, that's a monumental charter breach, the right to privacy, right? So, I would think any government that would propose to do that, that's like an Orwellian, 1984 kind of thing. The dates obviously are a date, but you get the concept, or it's Big Brother kind of thing. It's possible, right? It's very easy to do it because obviously at birth there's biologic material that could easily be captured and analyzed for DNA purposes. But that happening, I would think, and I could be totally wrong because I've got 40 years of civil rights to work on, but I would think there isn't anybody on the planet apart from some very zealot law enforcement personnel who would think that's a good idea. Well, and what's your second part, Val?
The second part was, I know they had stated that in the US it was predominantly African American. In Canada, is it the same here, or is it a different race that's more predominant? Is it diverse?
Everything that we see that happens in the States dealing with African Americans happens in Canada with respect to Indigenous accused, right? The parallels are symmetrical. So, and Rosen in the TED Talk talked about this in very quick terms, but it's the same in Canada. So, and I could tell you, and it's part of this whole process. So, Indigenous Canadians make up, in round terms, about 5% of the population. In the federal penal system, which means somebody is in a federal penitentiary, which means they've been sentenced 2 years or more. That's how you go into a federal penitentiary. Across the country, about 20% of all inmates are Indigenous, right? And we also have African Canadians as well, but to a much lesser degree. And in provincial jails, right, which is if you're sentenced to 2 years less a day. So, for instance, we have a jail in Sault Ste. Marie. It's up on Great Northern, just past the OPP, right? So that's a provincial jail. It's pretty much a remand center. So if you're arrested, you're waiting for bail or sometimes waiting for trial. If your trial's a long way off, you're going to go to one of the super jails in Ontario. We have 3 of them, one in Penetanguishene, one in Lindsay, and one in Toronto. They hold about 1,500 to 1,600 inmates each. That's where you're going to go. You'll be shipped out. Even if your alleged crime is here in Sault Ste. Marie, you're going to be waiting for trial in one of these super jails and then brought back to the Sault for your trial. But having said that, in provincial jails, particularly in the western provinces where there's a more of a Indigenous population than in Eastern Canada, the amount of the Indigenous nature of the inmates in provincial jails is over 50%, right? 5% of the population, 50% of the occupation, the inmates. And for women, Indigenous women are over 80% of all women incarcerated, right? So those numbers, are very symmetrical with what happens to African Americans in the US, right? They're incredibly overrepresented in all aspects of the criminal justice system, and includes things like, racial profiling, which is what Rosen talked about, the TED Talk. There's a ton of racial profiling in Canada, dealing with Aboriginal Canadians, just a ton of it, right? Cops, cops, and this is another whole class that I teach, but, they frequent places in a town or a city where they know that the Indigenous Canadians will gather at their own club or whatever it's going to be, and they expect there to be crime taking place, and so they go and they stalk it basically until crime does take place. Hence the incredible disproportionate nature of Indigenous Canadians in our prison system. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
William?
Hello?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious. When we watch this TED Talk, it is from the state side of things.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you can answer our Constitution, how it protects us from things like the familiar database. Is there a way that we can be protected from that, as well as how much more strict or even loose are we in the online database of, like, they can collect information from my online profile?
Well, it's the same thing that I just mentioned earlier. The Fourth Amendment in the United States. So for those of you who don't know, so the Bill of Rights wasn't put in place in the United States at the time of independence in 1776. In 1776, when they declared independence and entered into the Revolutionary War, it took about 5 or 6 years for that war to wind down, where it was decided basically in Europe that U.S. those states, as the 13 colonies became states, they basically won the war, as in Britain lost interest in fighting them. Britain was already fighting with France in Europe, always fighting with France, so it just didn't want to spend more money in the Americas. So it just said, look, God bless you, you can have your own country. It took another 5 or 6 years before those what became the states actually got their act together to become a real country. The states, the 13 colonies, became 13 states, particularly Virginia, which was the largest one. That's where George Washington and Thomas Jefferson came from. It was the largest state and the most powerful one. The states in the U.S. exercised a lot of power. Much more so than, for instance, the 4 colonies that became the first 4 provinces in Canada. Different mindset. And so it took a long time for the states to give up some of that power to, in fact, create a federal government that could do anything. So, what happened between 1776 and basically 1788 is that it took that long for the states to, basically decide that, we have to actually, if we're going to have a federal government, and George Washington was the first president, he was anointed basically as the first president. They basically said, look, we've got to give the federal government some money. So the states had to all agree to put money into a federal fund to create things like, an army, right? Which is a standing army. And so, in 1788-89, their constitution was agreed to. So that's how long it took to put it in place. And so, and it was put in place, but there were no rights in it. And so what happened is that over the course of the next, it still happens today, over the course of the next, however, 10 to 20 years, they started enacting amendments to the Constitution. Amendments being the first 10 of them becoming the U.S. Bill of Rights, right? So, the Fourth Amendment, which would have been passed in the 1890s, basically was protection against illegal search and seizure. In Canada, that wasn't put in place in Canada until 1982, when Pierre Trudeau patriated the Constitution and enacted the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, we did have, prior to the Charter, and clearly since Confederation, when we adopted the law of England, we did have, all kinds of due process rights that were part of the common law, right? So they were, there were, basically, police, had certain rules they had to follow, with respect to searching and seizing items or vehicles or whatever it's going to be. They had to follow a certain code of conduct as a function of common law, but it didn't have the weight of a constitutional document like the Charter. So it wasn't until 82 that we have that. And in the early days, just to answer William's question, it's a long way to get around to it, I'm sorry. In the early days, when the Charter was in place, and again, a lot of the things in the Charter, section 7 to 14, the due process rights, the right to a lawyer, the right to remain silent, the right to not to be subject to unusual, unreasonable search and seizure, the right for a speedy trial, all those kind of things that are due process rights, which mirror the U.S. Constitution. In the first 10 years of the Charter being in place, the Supreme Court of Canada referred to American jurisprudence all the time, right? Because there's because the Bill of Rights, the various sections of it have been in place for 200 years, basically, that there was a lot of jurisprudence, and a lot of it was translatable to Canadian situations. So it's not a function of what's more robust and what isn't. It's a function of which court at which time decides how to apply it. And as we'll see in the lecture tonight, when we deal with search and seizure, that Supreme Court of Canada has dealt with it in different ways, and there's a couple of cases in your textbook. So it's again, the Charter is seen to be an incredibly effective rights instrument. It's looked at worldwide, perhaps as maybe the best example of one that we have, which is great, and it is a very effective instrument, and sometimes quite often better than the U.S. Bill of Rights, because unfortunately in the U.S. The Supreme Court is so politicized now, with appointments either being Republican or Democratic, that the rights in the Bill of Rights are abused for political gain, right? We don't have that in Canada, right? Thank God that, there's no political affiliation with anybody who's appointed to the Supreme Court in Canada. So anyway, hopefully that answers it, William. It was a long and windy answer. Shivani, your hand is back up.
Yes.
Sure.
So I want to know, because they made reference in the video that a police cannot violate any rights, like they can't just infringe on person's right by just randomly searching them. They have to follow procedures, right? So I'm wondering if there's an exception to this, because I know back in Jamaica, when there's a state of emergency, there's an exception, a police can just randomly search you. So I want to know if this applies to Canada and the USA also.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. What we have, and it's a function of Section 91 of the Constitution Act, which is the 91.1, which is the power for peace, order, and good government for the federal government. Under that provision, the federal government is given the power to enact, and what we've done in the past is put in place what's called the War Measures Act. So what happens, and we've done this. We did this in the 1970s. With the FLQ crisis. Anybody want to give a synopsis of what the FLQ crisis was? Anybody out there? The Fédération de Libération de Québec. Basically, it was a movement, a domestic terrorist movement, actually, in Canada for an independent Quebec. And what they did is that they kidnapped a minister, Pierre Lapointe, Lapointe, from Quebec, and a British ambassador, John, I've forgotten his name, I apologize. Anyway, they kidnapped two people and killed Pierre Lapointe at Quebec. And so Pierre Trudeau basically implemented the War Measures Act in 1971-72, which basically did this. It suspended the right of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is an incredibly important term that you should all know. It's obviously, it's Latin. It means bring the body forth. Habeas corpus, Latin, corpus, body, right? Bring the body before the court. And by suspending that, what that means is that the government can arrest anybody they want, and they don't have to have a reason for it, right? They don't have to justify it, right? Habeas corpus, when it's working effectively, is there for anybody who has been arrested and they believe that the grounds for the arrest are faulty. They can immediately, get a writ of habeas corpus and go before a judge to have the justification, legitimacy of their arrest challenged. And it's used quite a bit in some circumstances in Canada, and it's used a lot in the United States. And the United States, has the power to do that as well. Abraham Lincoln right, suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the United States during the Civil War, right? There was times when the Union wanted to arrest Confederate officers and hold them without basically giving them the right to be heard before a judge, right? So yeah, there is a very real mechanism available in almost every democratic society to suspend due process rights if it's usually if it's in terms of things that, you know, domestic or international terrorism. It could be other reasons. It could be any reason you pick at all. But to be justified and not be totally questioned by the population, it would have to be something that would be really significant. Lexine, you had your hand up? Lexine, yes, no? Your hand actually went down. Are you good? Does anybody else have, that's a pretty good constitutional introduction to this class. Any other questions from anybody? We've covered a lot of material, but it's good. All right, so let's, hang on, there's a chat. Let me just check what this is. Okay, we're good. All right, guys, so let's go to the, the PowerPoints. So the first one is investigating, introduction to investigating, searching, and seizing mobile devices. All right, so let's go through this, and there's some videos to watch, and then we'll keep on motoring. All right, so, okay, so law enforcement, you know, and again, law enforcement, it says it's well-versed in laws of search and seizure, and sure it is. I mean, search and seizure is a significant role in the investigation of crime. Right, being able to have access to physical property or digital property by way of data in order to prove a case is incredibly important. As a function of that, almost every police officer, when they're trained, is trained, you know, fairly well in Canada, of course, with the operations of Section 8 of the Charter. You know, again, the right not to be unreasonably searched and seized, basically. Individuals and organizations sometimes, you know, are nowadays at greater risk of basically having their data stolen, right, as a function of the, you know, the ubiquitous use of digital devices. We've talked a lot about that, basically, right, and the risk that's been associated with these kind of thefts is anecdotal to a great degree. We have lots of real-life accounts of theft of data breach and losses of phones. Losses of phones, and this is the stat that's in your textbook. 70 million smartphones are lost every year. That's amazing. I mean, I'm not even sure how you would lose a smartphone, because for most of us, they're attached to us, you know, with an umbilical cord. So, you know, how they get lost, I don't know. But when they do, right, then, you know, there's a tremendous amount of personal data that is going to be found by somebody else who obviously, you know, basically didn't put it into the phone, right? And hopefully it would be turned in, that you could find it to fairly easily who it belongs to, or if the phone hopefully is encrypted so you can't get into it. But otherwise, you know, it's a lot of data that's lost each year, and therefore becomes available to be acquired for reasons other than, you know, your own personal use. Right? Cell phones and how they work, right? You guys know this stuff. This is pretty much common sense, right? So cell phones, you know, are connected versus LTE, long-term evolution, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And you guys are all familiar with that. Basically, signals are sent and received over a cellular network, and smartphones are connected via cell towers, which form adjoining hexagonal cells. So I got this diagram to show you what that is. And it just kind of makes sense, right? These are, everybody knows that, you know, Rogers and Bell and TELUS, they all put, you know, tons and tons of these towers up everywhere. And the whole idea, of course, is to have as seamless an environment for connectivity as possible. Now, you know, this is pretty much old school when it comes to connectivity, because Elon Musk, for instance, has put into space, you know, and I think his plan is to put in space like 20,000 satellites to connect the world, right? And his promise is, and he's actually said this to the Canadian government, he has he has a connection with Canada. He went to school here for a while, and his wife is Canadian. And so, he's basically said to the Canadian government that within a relatively short period of time, he believes as a function of satellite cellular service, that virtually everybody in Canada, even in the northern parts of the country, even northern Ontario, obviously, in the prairies and the territories, where there, you don't have as many towers, of course, as you would have in an urban center, so you don't have this hexagonal connectivity in place in the Yukon for the most part, or Nunavut or whatever. That Musk is basically saying that he can fix that with these tens of thousands of satellites. And I'm sure he's absolutely correct. I'm sure that the technology is there to do that. So, when he does that, I mean, he's already launched a whole bunch of them, and, you can actually see them in the sky. Sometimes it's like a string of pearls. That's his satellites, and he's not the only one doing that. So it's not, it's the way that things are obviously going to go. Right. So other devices. So cybercrime investigators, which being law enforcement, look at things beyond certainly cell phones or smartphones for the purposes of security. Right. And the weakest point in security of all of data basically is the user, you and me, for the most part. Right. If we allow those who want to gain access to our data by not encrypting or protecting ourselves the way that we're being told to do that, then we're obviously opening ourselves up for data breaches, right? And you have things, and we're going to see a little bit of video on this, on phishing, spear phishing, which is a little more sophisticated form of phishing, spyware, threats to information and privacy, corporate data, intellectual property. That's what IP is basically, and obviously what the author of the textbook is saying is that the way that the user stops becoming the most vulnerable target for this kind of thing is as a function of education and information and awareness. Okay, so here's what phishing is, for those who don't know.
What do you think a phishing attack looks like? This? Or this? Maybe this? Ugh, not quite. In this instance, we're spelling phishing with a PH, and it's one of the most common online scams around. So what is it? Say you receive an email from your bank. They're asking you to log into your account and update your details. They've even provided a handy link that will take you straight to the relevant page. Great. Except that email isn't from your bank, it's from me. And I've set up a very convincing website that looks just like your bank site. So when you click my link and follow the bank's instructions, what you're actually doing is giving me all your login information and whatever personal or banking data I've asked for. Thanks. These kinds of emails have become commonplace in recent years, to the point that they're a bit of a joke. We've all laughed at the Nigerian prince wants to send me his fortune email. It's so obviously a scam. How does anyone fall for it? Well, firstly, if it didn't work at least some of the time, no one would do it. But secondly, by making you believe that all phishing emails are that obvious, those scammers have lulled you into a false sense of security, meaning you're much less likely to spot a better executed attempt. In a 2015 study, 97% of people were unable to identify sophisticated phishing emails. How many of those people thought they were too smart to be fooled? Part of the problem is that many people don't realize how personalized phishing can be. Targeted attacks are called spear phishing, and they're geared towards you. Usually these phishers will have some prior information on you, taken from social media or online public records. They use this to tailor an email which seems too specific to be a generic scam, and so is far more believable and likely to yield results. And scammers know this. In a review of over 500,000 mailboxes, it was found that 77% of spear phishing attacks targeted 10 people or less. More alarmingly, 33% targeted just one. So what does one of these look like? Well, say your colleague has gone on holiday to Mexico. You know he's in Mexico because you saw him check into the airport on Facebook. A few days later, he sends you an email. He's really sorry to reach out. His phone, wallet, and passport have been stolen, but fortunately, he remembered your email address. Could you possibly wire him some money using this link? Obviously, he'll pay you back. He's just in a bit of a tight spot and needs to pay the consulate for his new passport. None of this is particularly far-fetched or difficult to believe, but all the same, it's not true. This is a spear phishing attempt. Your colleague's Facebook privacy settings are wide open, so his airport check-in was visible to the whole world, including our scammer, who only needed 5 minutes to Google your colleague's workplace, find you and your email address, and then fire off a compelling sob story. It doesn't even need to be that specific. How many people are going to question a Google Calendar meeting invitation from their boss? Just click here to RSVP, sign into Google, and as easy as that, you've given away your login details. So aside from ignoring emergency emails from your friends and deleting anything your boss sends you without opening it, what can you do to stay safe? Firstly, when you get an email, check, really check, that it is what it says it is. Secondly, never click any links provided. If someone wants you to log in, go to their website independently and log in from there. If you're still unsure, find a legitimate number and call the company involved to ask about the email. Customer security is a big deal, and they won't be fazed by being asked questions like this. Thirdly, if you absolutely have to follow a link, triple check the URL of the website you've been sent to and make sure it matches up with where you log in normally. Just seeing a padlock is not enough. There are all kinds of tricks to fool even those with a deep understanding of URL schemas, so you need to exercise extreme caution. Phishing attacks are called that for a reason. A lot of the time, those behind them are just throwing out a line and seeing who bites. But by being aware of how these kinds of scams operate and exercising vigilance, you're making it far less likely that you'll be the one to take the bait.
What about French toast?
French toast?
What about beef?
What about it?
Hey, we all know TikTok is a really cool app filled up with some funny homemade content. But does this app have enough spyware on it to scare even Bart Simpson? Or is this claim just a paranoid piece of propaganda? I've got the answer to that meme of a mystery, plus answers on a couple other things that you guys are, puzzled about. Like this picture that claims to show the world's largest RC plane, a picture that wants us to believe this jellyfish can live forever, and this picture claiming the ostrich shape in this plank of wood is completely natural. I've got all that plus a new mystery video, my favorite fake of the week, and a whole lot more, so isolate yourself where you are and get ready to test your brains in the real or fake zone. Hey guys, Bill here. We're going to be getting to our big story in just a minute, but first I want to give a big thanks to this week's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Do you ever get that feeling that somebody's watching what you're doing while you're on the internet? I know I do, and it's not just because I'm paranoid. The internet is filled with thousands of eyes who want nothing more than to track your movements and grab as much information about you as possible. Now, I know what some of you guys are going to say. They only do that so they can show me ads about stuff I'm more interested in. Well, hold on a minute, because you know what? A lot of that snooping is by real bona fide bad guys who want to steal your identity and turn your life into a real nightmare. Especially now when everybody's doing the work at home thing. So you know what I do to keep myself safe? I use Private Internet Access. Private Internet Access is really easy to use privacy protection software. In just a few clicks, like you see me doing here, you can keep yourself private and safe when you use the internet at home or in public. It's compatible with most operating systems, including Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, Amazon Fire Stick, Linux, and more. It's the PC Mag Editor's Choice 2020, making it the best VPN for 2020. What I like about it most is it doesn't slow down your internet and allows you to unblock region-specific content. Guys, when it comes to privacy protection, Private Internet Access is the one for me. And once you try it, I'm sure it's going to be the one for you, too. Just use my special link in the description box and get up to 76% off and 2 extra months for free. So what are you waiting for? Get clicking and protect yourself before it's too late. Okay, now that we know how cool it is to have private internet access in our corner, what do you say we get back to this claim that TikTok is a spy app? The story was first sent in by Kinta, who just wrote, "Hey Bill, is TikTok really a spy app made in China?" Kinta, I think the real question here is how we're going to define spyware. Because, as we all know, other companies like Facebook and Google and YouTube, they all gather information on us. But the question here is TikTok taking it further by actually putting spyware that not only collects our information, but also account numbers, passwords, keystrokes, things that we're actually doing on our phones and computers. Let's take a look. Taking a closer look at the news article Kinta sent in, we see it comes from a British newspaper called the Daily Mail. Now, the Daily Mail is not the most reliable newspaper in the world, but let's see what they have to say. Basically, it tells us that TikTok is actually owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. And that's why many people think it's a security threat, because this means the app might be sharing data with the Chinese government. Now, I don't know if you know this, but there is a law in China that allows the Chinese government to ask and get any information they want from Chinese-owned companies. The article then goes on to say that both the Australian military and the U.S. Army have both banned service personnel from using the app. I can see why the military might be concerned about that. I mean, imagine yourself in a future scenario. Let's say you're having a war with China. Well, China, to find out where all your soldiers are, all they have to do is check the GPS, which they can get to through the TikTok app. The article goes on to talk about the threat to children being spied upon, but not much else.
This is a threat to American security. When China has data on 110 million Americans, who knows what they do with it?
I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, we have people like Steve Huffman, the CEO of Reddit, declaring that TikTok is spyware. But then we have the company TikTok itself, which is denying all that and pointing out that their servers are only located in the United States and Europe, and they are not sharing information with the Chinese government. So, I'll tell you what, why don't we take a vote? Let's see how you guys are feeling. Now, if you think there's actual spyware on TikTok, I want you to vote real. If you think, on the other hand, they're just a normal app and they just collect the normal information like everybody else from Facebook to YouTube, then I want you to vote fake. And if you don't think we have a solid answer, then you vote unknown. Okay, so go ahead and leave me your votes up here. If that doesn't work for you, you can always leave your answers down in the comment section. And if neither one of those are working, you just shout it out. Okay, you ready? And go. Hey, while we're waiting for everybody to make their choices and vote, what do you say we take a look at this week's mystery video? A bunch of people sent in this video, including Tom Valentino, who asked, "What is this stuff?" Tom, I have no idea, but maybe one of our informed viewers might know and let us know what it is in the comment section. Here's another version of this video that claims that goo is actually living venom.
What the hell are you? We are Venom.
Speaking of mysteries, does anybody know what this is? I mean, is this an old plane or a Star Wars prop? By the way, I want to thank all those people who left answers last week to this video, especially this person who sent this. The general consensus is the trucks are called BM-13 Katyushas, and they can fire up to 24 rockets each. So, looks like this video might be real after all. Okay, so what do you say we get back to our little espionage story and find out what the official answer is? Because I really want to know personally. I've got that app on my phone. If this thing turns out to be real, well, you know where that app is going. Despite the fact that 700 million people signed up for TikTok last year. That's more than YouTube. And the official answer is... unknown. unknown. While we don't have the tools to actually check and find solid evidence that there is spyware in the app, Gary Malivsky, publisher of Cyber Defense Magazine, says it certainly has creepware on it.
So the difference between spyware and creepware: spyware, you are guaranteed to be spied on. You know who's doing it. You know, we've discovered that this spyware connects to a server in a government agency or, you know, say a criminal gang in another country. In this case, TikTok has so much data collection capability, turning on microphone and webcam and looking at your contacts list and geolocating you, and so many features and functions and permissions. You've given them permission to be pretty creepy. You hope on the other side they're not creeps. So creepware is software that just has way too many permissions beyond what it really needs to do.
Now that we know all this, I asked Gary what he thinks we should do with our TikTok apps. He suggested we just switch them out.
I'd look for something made in America, or even in the EU, somewhere where the laws, you know, China's internet laws are very different than the US. Because that company is Beijing, if the Chinese government says, give us a feed every split second out of your app and the servers when you collect it, that company has to comply with that law. If the U.S. said that, they would say, I'm taking you to the Supreme Court, you know, or I'm going to fight in my local court system. Don't be surprised if this is real spyware that is, you know, a front as a company, but doing work for the Chinese government. Don't be surprised. That does happen.
That was Gary Malivsky from Cyber Defense Magazine, which, by the way, is free to subscribe to. I'm going to leave a link for it down in the description box so you can check it out. Thanks, Gary. Next up is this picture. It was sent in by Mango Man, who just wrote, is this really the biggest RC plane in the world? Mango Man, when I first opened up your picture, my jaw dropped. I mean, I'm used to seeing RC planes about this size, but I've never seen anything like this. Holy cow. From the looks of it, it's an Airbus A380, which is the biggest passenger aircraft in the world. So I would assume this one has to be the biggest RC plane in the world. Okay, guys, take a good look over and then let me know what you think. If you think this really is the biggest RC plane in the world, then vote real. But on the other hand, if you think there's still yet another RC plane out there that's even bigger than this one, then you vote fake. And as usual, if you don't think we have an answer, you just vote unknown. So go ahead and give me your votes up here. Answers down in the comment section or shout it out. I'm going to get out this and we're going to find out if we really got the biggest RC controlled plane in the world, you know. And it may be a growing thing because, you know, they're going to stop making the real A380s. I don't really know why, but, you know, who knows? Maybe they could keep making these model versions. And if they get any bigger, you could probably put people in them. Let's see. Oh, and the official answer is... You ready for this? Fake. As it turns out, the biggest RC plane in the world is this Boeing 747. This thing is 5.3 meters or 18 feet long, and the A380, it turns out, is only 4.82 meters or 16 feet long. The strange thing about these planes is, as big as they are, they can only carry enough fuel to fly for about 10 minutes.
Throughout the centuries, an immortal clan has fought the timeless war of good and evil.
The list of movies with immortal characters in them seems almost endless in itself.
You cannot die, McLeod. Accept it.
The theme of immortality is stuff that fiction is made from. But what if there's a creature that really is immortal on this planet and it looks like this? The picture was sent in by MVCC, who wrote, is this jellyfish really immortal? MVC, I can think of a lot of other creatures that would be much better contenders to be immortal than a jellyfish. Like maybe tardigrades? These little guys are known to be the most indestructible species in the world, so maybe they could live forever. But who knows? Maybe a...
Okay, so I'm going to leave it for you guys to figure out whether the jellyfish is immortal or not. that's beyond what we're dealing with. I am curious though. I don't use TikTok, never have, but could somebody just put your hands if TikTok is something that you actually use? I've got two. Just two of you? 3? 4? Well, there you go. And so you know much more about it. Oh, 5. Okay. So, there you go. Your information goes to China, allegedly. All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate that. So that's a quarter of the class. So there you go. Okay. So let's go. Oh, Val, you raised your hand. Is that just say yes or just you have a question? Just take, okay, cool. All right. So again, back to the specifics of search and seizure. And we talked about this at the beginning of the class. We talked about this last week. So this is what Charter Section 8 says. It's very simple. It says everyone has the right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure. Okay, and that's all it says. Okay. I don't know why that line is on there. That's a mystery to me, but okay. All right. Somebody's using a whiteboard. Isn't that odd? All right. Okay. All right. And then what's relevant about Section 8, obviously, is you have a charter right, and if it's breached, then you go to Section 24 of the Charter, which is the remedy section. And Section 1 deals with judgments for damages relating to charter breaches, but subsection 2 is the really important one when it comes to law enforcement and basically being allowed or disallowed in putting evidence into a trial that has been illegally searched and seized. So what Charter Section 2 says, where in proceedings under subsection 1, which again is a court proceeding dealing with the charter, a court concludes that evidence was obtained in a manner that infringed or denied any rights or freedoms guaranteed by this charter. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just Section 8. It could be Section 10, the right to remain silent, Section 11, the right for a speedy trial. So it doesn't have to be 8. They all fit within this particular subsection. The evidence shall be excluded if it is established that, and this is really important, having regard to all the circumstances, the admission of it in the proceedings would bring the administration of justice into disrepute. Anybody want to give a shot at what you think that actually means? All right, it doesn't say that if the court rules that somebody, police service, has illegally obtained evidence contrary to Section 8, it does not say that it's automatically excluded from a trial. What does that wording actually say? Anybody? All right. So, William, give it a shot.
Yeah, shoot. It's probably not going to be right. But basically, I'm thinking that the admission of it into the proceedings, when they say that it would hinder previous cases or future cases, possibly based off of how it's obtained.
That's a good answer. It's very possible. I mean, it would deal with obviously with future cases. So what you're saying is that the judge, in making a decision excluding the evidence, may be a precedent for future cases. Absolutely true. It may well be, depending on which level of court made the decision. Right? We have a system of stare decisis, so judges have to pay attention to judgments of higher courts. So if you're in the Provincial Court of Ontario, which is the lowest trial division we have, tends to hear the lower level criminal matters, you have to pay attention to decisions in the Superior Court of Ontario. So that's the higher level court for trial purposes in Ontario. And then they have to pay attention to decisions of the Ontario Court of Appeal, right? And the Ontario Court of Appeal and all of those other lower courts have to pay attention, obviously, to the Supreme Court of Canada. So that's how it works. So that's a good answer, William. Anybody else have anything to add to this? All right, so what it says beyond the fact that if something is illegally basically obtained by the police, contrary to the charter, what it says is that a judge can find that there was an illegal search and seizure, but at the same time, if the judge believes that excluding it would bring the administration of justice into disrepute, the judge can still allow it to be admitted into evidence, right? That's really, really important. What that does is that gives the court, and this is much different than the Fourth Amendment of the American Constitution, right? It doesn't give judges this kind of discretion. So in Canada, we have this kind of discretion, which basically says if the judge, basically what happens is if the accused thinks that the Crown, the prosecutor in Canada, has obtained evidence that has been illegally obtained, right? And it's a jury trial. So before that evidence ever gets in front of the jury, the accused makes a motion to the judge to exclude it under section 24(2) of the charter. And so the judge will have the jury removed from the courtroom. And then we have basically, it's called a voir dire. It's a trial within a trial. And the accused will argue that the nature of the search and seizure, it was illegal, and the admission of the evidence would be highly prejudicial to the case and should be excluded. The Crown will argue, and this is often the case, that the evidence they're trying to get in is probably the most important evidence that the Crown has. So it's possession of drugs for the purpose of trafficking. The cops basically had pulled over a car and without a warrant, opened the trunk of the car and found a lot of drugs, right? And in a case where in fact a warrant should have obtained, or they knocked on somebody's door in a house and they just walked in and found drugs in the house, and they found a lot of them, and as a function of that, they believed that those drugs were there for trafficking, right? And you can't under any circumstances go into somebody's house without a warrant. That's an absolute rule, basically, unless they're running through a door after committing a crime and the cops chasing them running through the door. That's the only time cops can ever go into somebody's house without a warrant. All right, so the accused basically argues that yes, there was 6 bricks of cocaine found in the dresser drawer in somebody's bedroom, but because they didn't have a warrant going into the house, it was a breach of the charter. The judge would rule that, in fact, yes, that clearly is a breach of the charter. But the Crown would argue, Your Honor, the nature of the quantity of the drugs found, the 6 bricks, and the prospect that would very, very likely be trafficking. Nobody consumes that kind of cocaine for personal use, I guess. And more importantly, the Crown would argue that, if we don't have this evidence go in, it would be travesty, right? The public, which is the administration of justice the judge is thinking about, the public would see this, obviously reported in the media, and they would basically be abhorred if somebody who is a drug dealer clearly was allowed to basically walk away from the trial because the Crown wasn't going to proceed, because its main evidence couldn't be admitted. Right, and so that's the kind of thing that a judge would consider, as in, should I allow the 6 bricks in? Is it, would that bring the administration of justice into disrepute? Yeah, it probably would, right? Unless, of course, that the nature of the search was so egregious, they broke down the door, threw the girlfriend out the window, and found this stuff in an incredibly dangerous way. The judge may well decide not to admit it if that was the kind of search that took place, but it's a judgment call. That's what judges do, right? And that's what that means. So that's how it works in Canada. All right. With respect to, again, back to cell phones, right? So judges, there's a lot of this stuff in Chapter 4 for you to read. Courts consider, the content of cell phones, for instance, as to whether or not it is going to be allowed to be searched, with or without a warrant, right? So courts will consider how a message was communicated. So did somebody send a message on the phone that it wasn't encrypted, it was an open message, a text message could easily be read by anybody, that kind of thing. There was really no privacy. We talked about this last class about how much privacy is important with respect to being able to look at somebody's messages, right? If the police do in fact want to look at a cell phone, they've seized it, but they haven't looked at it, then what they do is they give what's called an assistance order under the criminal code, which means they bring in an IT specialist who, basically helps them get into the data on the phone. So that's the way the system works, basically. We also have, basically threats to mobile phones, which is really important, basically, and that deals with what we call malware. So that's a term I'm sure you're all familiar with, right? Oh, William, your hands up again.
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
When it comes to cell phones, say I message you something, I consider it to be a personal message between you and me only. and the cops get your phone, like you legally, like you willfully give them your phone, can our conversations be used in a court of law because I'm under the assumption that our conversations are private, or no?
Well, the two cases that are in Chapter 4 that they give reference to, both Supreme Court of Canada's decisions, actually are rule on both sides of that exact question. In the one case, the basically retrieval of data on somebody's phone where that data came from somebody else. The court ruled that there would be no expectation of privacy in that, and therefore allowed the data, the content of the message to go into the evidence. And the other case ruled the other way, right? So it's an open question, right? There's still lots of open questions about it. Again, it would be, the nature of the message is really, really important, right? So it's not, so if somebody else has received it, it's not necessarily going to be excluded, but it may well be excluded based upon the content. So this is the kind of case where, in fact, again, a voir dire would take place before the jury heard about what it was, and the judge would basically look at the content of the message and decide how it was sent, what it basically says. Is it something that is of a private nature that there would be a reasonable, and that's obviously the word to work with, reasonable expectation of privacy in that message, right? So that's the test still. And there's further tests we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Here's a relatively short video on malware.
The total cost of damage caused by malware in 2015 was about $500 billion. In 2019, that jumped to $2 trillion, and it's expected to hit $6 trillion in 2021. To put that into perspective, that's more than the entire retail sales of all of the United States. Needless to say, there is a lot of money being made in cybercrime and malware, and it's only going to increase. And so I figured for this episode of Decoder, a series here on the channel where I explain a new piece of tech regularly, we should dive into what malware actually is, the different types of malware that there are, and the ones that you're more likely to run into, and then how they work, and so with all of that, how we can avoid them. Really quick, shout out to Bitdefender for sponsoring this video. As an expert in the anti-malware industry, they helped a ton with the research for this video, but we'll talk about them more in a sec. Now I want to be clear, this video is not meant to try to scare you like a lot of the anti-malware videos that you see on the internet. Truthfully, the digital and connected worlds that we live in, malware is just something that we're gonna have to deal with, and it's actually pretty prominent. So I feel like the more we know about it, the more we know how it works, the better off we are at avoiding it, and the less, frankly, that we have to worry about it. So first off, what is malware? Technically, the term comes from a combination of the words malicious and software, but that's a pretty broad term. I mean, by that definition, I could include Premiere Pro, as I swear it crashes on purpose because it's evil. So Bitdefender's definition is software that has a bad intention as far as your personal information, computer, and operating system are concerned. Now, of course, the first type of malware that is associated with that definition are viruses. But to be completely honest, that term and malware get used interchangeably, and that's not really right. We need to address that real quick. A virus is an application that can copy itself by attaching its code to other files on the system. Think like how a cold infects the cell in your body, hence the name. The worst of these would then do this and spread from computer to computer, damaging and compromising the integrity of each infected computer. For malware to be a virus, it needs to be able to infect files in this way, and honestly, since they corrupt files, they are easily identified by computers and anti-malware software, so they actually aren't really used very often by hackers nowadays, accounting for less than 1% of the global threats according to Bitdefender's own studies. So all viruses are a type of malware. The two terms should not be used interchangeably, and actually the chances of you coming across a virus nowadays are actually pretty slim. So what are the most common malware types today that are causing the most damage? First up, we have keyloggers. These are essentially the malware equivalent of someone looking over your shoulder while you're at the ATM entering in your PIN code to withdraw money. This software is installed on an infected computer and intercepts everything you type and puts it into a log, hence the name, along with screenshots and mouse clicks, etc. in some cases, and then sends that log to its owner occasionally, essentially giving them your logins for things like your bank site, e-commerce sites for your credit card info, email logins, which they can then use to log into other financial accounts, etc. And frankly, keyloggers are difficult to detect, especially on shared computers like in a cafe, a library, a hotel, etc. And this is why you should avoid logging into anything terribly sensitive on any of these types of computers. And on your own computer, being careful not to download files from places or people that you don't know can help limit your exposure. Next up is ransomware. And this one's become very popular recently and is all over the news. According to a study by Bitdefender in 2015, ransomware caused $350 million worth of damage, and some estimates have organizations and individuals paying out over $11.5 billion in 2019, and it is only expected to continue to increase. Now, the idea behind ransomware is essentially that it infects your computer and then proceeds to encrypt all of the data on it so that you can no longer view or retrieve it. Then the program requires you to pay a ransom, usually between $300 and $900 in some form of hard-to-trace currency like Bitcoin, in order for you to decrypt the files and give you access to them again. And if that $11.5 billion number is anything to go by, there's no wonder that they're the malware of the moment currently. Now, the way that they are spread is again very similar to other versions of malware here, usually in some sort of cleverly crafted email that has an attachment in the form of an invoice, a delivery note, resumes, or some other type of file related to what's in the email. Some ransomware, though, can also be disguised as advertising banners on some websites that use exploits or known vulnerabilities in usually older versions of browsers and then crash the browser and install their code. And some have even been found installed in illegal downloads found on popular torrent websites as well. Now, of course, again, be careful of any files through email or sites you don't know or trust. But because this malware also has been known to infect computers in other ways, you should take some other precautions as well. Firstly, back up your important files regularly to a drive that is not constantly connected to your computer, as a lot of ransomware out there is able to encrypt attached storage as well, by the way. I have a quick list of some super fast and affordable drives that I just did a video on, and you can check out some of those if you need some recommendations. Next, make sure that your computer is completely up to date, as well as whatever browser you are using. A lot of times they use exploits that are then patched in newer versions of both of these things, and so being on the latest version can also help. Besides that, Bitdefender actually worked with the local authorities to provide free decryptors for some of the most popular ransomware threats out there, and you can check that out at the link below. Another one of the most common types of malware that you've probably also heard of is called phishing. And technically, it's not its own software, so I don't know if it's technically malware. Whatever, it's really popular, so we're gonna include it. The idea behind this is that just like the hobby phishing that the name is based on, an attacker will send out various emails, instant messages, and even put links on social networks, forums, etc. in the hopes that someone will fall for it, click it, and end up giving up some valuable information. A common example of this is you receiving an email supposedly from your bank. It'll have your bank logos on it and other visual cues to make it seem like it is actually your bank sending the message. It's not. And it'll maybe have some sort of threat that if you don't click the link within it and...
Okay, so we've seen the phishing and the spear phishing before, so I'm not gonna repeat that, but obviously those are threats to your phone. Carrie, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly share a personal story around that. At the beginning of the semester, I bought myself a new computer and printer, and I could not get the wireless working with my printer no matter what I tried. And I ended up calling the printing company and allowing them access to my computer to try and sort that out. And my computer, being less than 24 hours mine, new out of the box, had like over 100 different viruses just simply from my IP address, and hence I hired security programming to remove that. But just the amount that, like, you know, whatever my kids have been looking at or whatnot, without that security system, that I had literally done nothing other than try and hook up my printer, and it was already filled with hundreds, like 2 pages worth of lovely viruses.
Yeah, I had not quite as egregious as that quickly, but the last cell phone I had, had some kind of malware in it. And what it did is first off, it really slowed it down. And then it made it so that the battery wouldn't hold the charge. Right, and I don't know how it does that, but it did that, and so I had to actually buy a new phone. But there was no fixing that. I mean, I bought another battery and it did this exact same thing. So this kind of stuff is out there, right? And so thanks, Carrie, I appreciate that. Okay, so back to what the cops are going to do, basically. So now again, remember we talked about this last week. So cops again, they can't stop you on the street, right? And ask to see your cell phone, ask to see the data. They just can't do that. But there are circumstances that will give rise to a court looking at, allowing the cops to, in fact, seize your phone. But here's what has to happen. Basically, you have to be committing a crime at the time, right? Or certainly related to, the crime in the phone. So exigent circumstances means that there are circumstances that are urgent to a great degree, that something is taking place right at that time. So what that would basically permit would be what's called a warrantless search. So they don't have to go to a justice of the peace and provide reasonable and probable cause to search the phone. If they see a crime, if you're involved in a crime, in the moment, and the phone is part of that circumstance, then they can seize the phone, right, for that purposes. Again, the two cases, and this is what I referred to in the answer for William, the Regina and Fearon and Regina and Maricopa. Basically, both those cases are the Supreme Court basically giving different answers to some degree with respect to the law of search and seizure. So again, it's a complex law that is still evolving. Here are the four things that a court has to find. This is the test, a four-part test for the purposes of accessing data on a cell phone. So, again, it's a function of a crime. So if it's your phone, then when you're arrested, the arrest must be lawful. Okay, so it has, and all cops have to do for an arrest to be lawful, even if eventually, the charges are thrown out or it ends up being a wrongful conviction and you're exonerated, down the road, a lawful arrest just simply is that the police have reasonable and probable grounds to believe you committed a crime. Doesn't mean that they at that point can prove that you committed it beyond a reasonable doubt, right? That's the job of the Crown during the trial. It just means that they have to, basically have a pretty good belief that in fact you've committed a crime, and it's both an objective and a subjective test when it comes to the cops. So again, subjectively, the police themselves, the ones who are making the arrest, have to believe that you committed a crime. And then objectively, a court looking at it would look at all the circumstances of the arrest and in a reasonable, objective fashion say, yes, it would be reasonable for that police officer to think that there were grounds for the arrest. So that's what's required for an arrest to be lawful. The search must be incidental to the arrest, which means that the phone itself must be part of why you're being arrested, right? So that it has to be integral to or incidental to the arrest. So it just can't. You're not going to get, the phone is not going to be taken and examined and be part of the evidence just because it's in your pocket when you're committing a crime, right? It has to be related to the arrest, which means the unlawful activity, right? The nature and the extent of the search must be tailored to its purpose. So this is now the phone has been seized, right? You've got the assistance order for an IT specialist to basically help gather the data that's on the phone, but the information being gathered has to be tailored to the purpose of the arrest and or proving the crime. So all data is not fair game. Only data that is relevant to the cause before the court, basically. And lastly, the cops who in fact do the arrest and seize the phone, and for the purposes of proving those first 3 points, they have to take really meticulous notes. Now, cops have to take meticulous notes all the time for everything they do. When there's an investigation or somebody's being questioned for a crime, all those kind of things, there have to be really good notes. They have to be contemporaneous, which means they have to be written down, as quickly as possible after the events have taken place. They're obviously not going to write them down during an arrest, but when after the arrest has taken place and they've delivered somebody to the local jail, they have to sit down pretty quickly and write their notes out so that they are, contemporary with the actual arrest taking place, right? And the purpose of that is, and it's the last sentence there, the record keeping requirement is important to the effectiveness of after the fact judicial review. And again, what is the after the fact judicial review? Anybody? What's the nature of that? That's the Section 24 Charter challenge using Section 8 of the Charter that the search has been an unreasonable search and seizure. Okay, that's the after the fact review, is the Charter challenge to keep the evidence out. All right, we have, and it goes into a lot of detail in your text, we have basically the process that the police go through with respect to what they have to do to garner the data. It goes beyond just the assistance order, basically. So they have to basically, go through a number of things, and they're all set out in pages 85 to 90 in your text with some pretty good examples. So, if you want to see the exact detail on what's involved and what the different kinds of orders are that are often used to retrieve data, then you'll see it there. I'm not going to repeat it for you here, but it's there for you to, certainly to take a look at on your own, right? And the last thing, or the second last thing with respect to, this particular chapter on mobile devices and gaining access to them is to stop, think, and connect. That's a public safety message that's put out there by Public Safety Canada. Always consider physical security, updated software on your phone, strong passwords. By the way, does anybody know what it takes to have a strong password? It's actually pretty simple, but it's maybe not what you think it is. What do you think you need to have a strong password? Anybody? Right. Tom?
I think you have to have the password at least 8 letters, a capital letter, and some numbers, something like that.
All right, so a combination of letters and numbers and symbols, that kind of thing, right?
Yes.
You said 8. Why did you say 8?
Because it's pretty long. I feel like I'm not sure.
Did 8 just pop in your head, or did you remember seeing it written down somewhere?
Yeah, I always see it's written down somewhere.
Yeah, and I've seen that a lot too. There was another hand that popped up. Anybody? You're quite right, Tom. Most sites, then even when you have Gmail accounts, very simple kind of for the purposes of passwords. Most sites do ask you to have a certain length of password. And with a capital and small, uppercase and lowercase letters and a symbol. Most of them ask for that. But the surest way to have a safe password is to make it long. That is the key to password safety. The longer it is, doesn't have to be uppercase, lowercase, or symbols. It could all be numbers. It could all be letters. Right? It doesn't have to be any particular mixture of those. But the longer it is, the safer it is. That's a fairly simple rule to remember. Okay, and here's just a last video on encryption and what and how it works.
Hi, Amazon? Yeah, I received my package, but it's super encrypted. I don't think I can open it. I don't have the software for it. Yeah, I'll hold. Encryption protects your emails, banking transactions, and even those questionable Etsy purchases. It's a way of protecting data from malicious hackers, spies, and online criminals. In an encryption scheme, a mathematical algorithm scrambles information, plain text, into gibberish, ciphertext, that can only be decoded by its intended recipient. Julius Caesar actually used ciphertext by moving the letters in the alphabet 3 spaces down. So A would equal X. This would turn a normal message into a strange grouping of letters that could only be deciphered by those who knew the technique. In a classic example, Alice wants to send Bob a message. Eve, however, is eavesdropping on them and intercepting their communications. So how can Alice and Bob communicate without having their convo heard? Alice and Bob decide to use public key encryption. In this scheme, Alice and Bob each have 2 sets of keys, a public one, which everyone can see and access, and a private one, which they must keep secret at all times. Data encrypted with a public key can only be opened using a private key, and data encrypted with a private key can only be opened with a public key. Alice uses Bob's public key to encrypt her message. Now, only Bob's private key can open the message. Bob receives it and uses the private key to open it. But how can Bob be sure that Alice really sent the message? Instead, Alice will use Bob's public key and her private key to encrypt the message. Bob must use Alice's public key and then his private key to open the message and verify that it is really from her. Eve, all the while, cannot see the message because she does not have anyone's secret keys. Well, wait a minute. Has anyone ever figured out what Alice was trying to say to Bob? And what's going on with Eve? Like, why is it so important that she needs to know everything they're saying to each other? Seriously, this has always bothered me. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Make sure.
All right, guys, so that's the end of the lecture for chapter 4. So let's do chapter 5, all right? It won't take that long. It's about 14 slides. Really interesting, though. It deals with personal information, what it is, and how to protect it, again. So obviously, things that, hang a sec. Oh, hang a sec. Where'd it go? Sorry, guys. Yeah, this is right. Okay. Easily confused. All right, guys, so this is chapter 5, so let's do this. So why is personal information so important? And you guys would all be aware of this because obviously, you know, you've been putting personal information online for a fair period of time, right? Personal information it really does define who you are, right? Everything that you put online in some way or other is data that, you know, can be used to craft the person that you want the world to see and maybe even you don't want them to see. Right, personal data certainly helps law enforcement identify people that they interact with. So that's, you know, obviously that's an important purpose of law enforcement. And importantly, it's a commodity, right? It's something that cyber criminals, those who abuse the internet, you know, basically take advantage of for their own purposes, more often than not to get money. All right, so here's a quick definition on what it is.
Take a look in the mirror. What do you see? Yourself, of course. But who are you? What makes you, you? There are lots of things. Your personality, your favorite food, your pet, or your favorite movie. Sharing this personal information on your phone or computer can be a lot of fun and can help you connect with other people. Sharing something fun that happened keeps a great memory alive. And sharing what you know teaches other people new ideas. Before you share, however, it's important to pause and think. Some information about you, like your full name, your address, or your date of birth, can be used to identify you individually. This information is private and should not be shared online, unless you get permission first from an adult you trust. So, when it comes to sharing about you, personal info can be okay. But private info? No way. Think before you share. With friends, with your community, and with the world. So, what information do you share online?
Okay. All right, so what type of information is targeted in a data breach? And again, a lot of this is common sense, but you know, it's important to repeat it. Things that are targeted are personal information, demographic information, phone numbers, job titles, IP addresses. There's lots of them. Your usernames and your passwords, obviously. I mean, if anybody gets your passwords, then your data is totally accessible, right? Things that are often stolen are social insurance numbers and credit and debit cards, online payment kind of things, subscription services. All of these kind of things, again, are data, right? And it's data that can be used against you. You know, it could become the subject of things like ransomware, right? Particularly if it's things like bank accounts and what have you, or again, we talked about this last day, information stored by companies like Equifax on your credit ratings and your credit card information and what have you, basically, right? How do they occur and what happens to the data? Well, you know, clearly they occur because, you know, the paperwork, I mean, hard copies of information can be acquired, or laptops are stolen, right? And again, we saw just, you know, getting in the class, 70 million smartphones go missing every year, right? Business tools are targeted for malware because businesses and organizations have funding, right? They are sources of cash to a great degree for, again, things like malware and ransomware, right? Breaches occur through, you know, things like human error, which we all make. So that's certainly possible, basically. And in real terms, from a cyber criminal's point of view, personal information, you know, can be sold as what are considered to be a commodity, property, digital goods. That's what it's referred to. All right.
Another major setback for Facebook. The social media giant, already under fire for not protecting users' private information, now admitting it's been hacked again. This time, many are wondering how safe is their personal information.
A massive cyber attack affecting nearly 50 million Facebook users. CEO Mark Zuckerberg confirming the new breach in a conference call Friday.
On Tuesday afternoon, our engineering team found an attack affecting up to 50 million accounts on Facebook.
Now Zuckerberg is in the hot seat again, less than 6 months after testifying about data security in front of Congress.
It will be hard for us to guarantee that we're going to fully stop everything.
In the latest attack, hackers exploited a feature called View As that lets users see how their profile appears to others. It's bad news for the company, which has seen its traffic plummet 50% in 2 years. Many users understandably shaken.
So much has gone down with Facebook that my trust in the site is kind of scrapped.
You would think Facebook would have secure firewalls to prevent all that.
I feel like any website, like, I wouldn't trust fully because there's a chance that it can be hacked. Yeah, that's scary.
According to Zuckerberg, whose own account was compromised in the latest breach, the vulnerability has been patched and all of the affected accounts were logged out. All you have to do is log back in.
And we will also notify these people in a message on top of their news feeds about what happened when they log back in.
It's been a tough 2 years for the social media giant, which was investigated by the FTC and the FBI when the political consultancy firm Cambridge Analytica gained access to the data of 87 million users. That prompting an apology from Zuckerberg to Congress.
It was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and at the end of the day, I'm responsible for what happens here.
This morning, a new blow to Facebook as it struggles to regain the trust of its users again.
So, Miguel, is Facebook going to get in any trouble for this latest breach?
Well, they face a $1.6 billion fine in Europe, and guys, there's a class action lawsuit underway here in the States.
All right, Miguel, thank you.
All right, guys, so now we're going to talk about how important it is to keep private information, personal information private, and the kind of damage that can take place. And we're going to talk about a very specific case that, you know, got worldwide attention for personal information getting out there that harmed a lot of people. So identity theft, you know, is the most prevalent type of data breach. So we all should recognize that. And it's a real challenge for law enforcement because of the incredible growth of personal information and how it grows. It's just exponential. So, you know, staying on top of it is virtually impossible. And again, we talked about how, the large metropolitan police services often have cybercrime units, but small ones likely don't. So, the Sault Ste. Marie Police Service probably doesn't have a cybercrime unit. Although I will actually, I'll email a friend of mine at this police service and I'll ask him, and I'll get back to you with that answer. Right? Businesses obviously are affected. Again, they have cash, so they're going to be the subject of ransom ransomware, basically. Why is it important to protect personal information? Well, to avoid having to pay money, obviously. But really, and that goes at the heart of it, is sometimes disclosure of personal information can damage a reputation, not only, and it says here, companies and institutions, but on a really personal level, sometimes your activity online with certain websites, if it becomes known, could be really damaging. And so we're going to talk about this particular case. It was an incredibly famous one called Ashley Madison. Anybody know what Ashley Madison is? It's lost a lot of its prestige, if that's what you call it, because of this. Anybody know what this website deals with? Okay. If you don't, Carrie, sure.
It was supposed to be a discreet dating site for married individuals, basically.
Married individuals to do what?
To a discreet dating site for married individuals.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly right. It was a site, still is, but again, not nearly as popular. It was a site specifically designed for married individuals to have affairs. Right, and you can see their tagline on the screen: "Life is short, have an affair." All right, so and interesting enough, you're going to see that the reason for the hack, right, and the demands of those who in fact did hack this site is not to get money. So let's take a watch of this.
Last month, hackers calling themselves the Impact Team breached servers belonging to AshleyMadison.com, a website that touts itself as the premier forum for cheating spouses who want partners for infidelity. The hackers, according to a document they released at the time, took issue with the site assisting cheaters. They also took issue with what they considered to be fraudulent business practices. For a $19 fee, Ashley Madison offered a service whereby the site promised to delete all of a customer's account and account activity. But the hackers said the site lied, and although the data was deleted from the public-facing part of the site, the company retained the data on its back-end servers. The hackers made a single demand after the breach occurred. They demanded that Avid Life Media, the Canada-based parent company of Ashley Madison, take down the Ashley Madison site, as well as another site the company operates called Established Men. This site was designed to connect young, beautiful women with sugar daddies who would support their lifestyle. The hackers deemed this essentially prostitution. If Avid Life Media failed to take down the two sites, the hackers warned, they would release customer data. And that's exactly what happened this week. On Tuesday, they released 9.7 gigabytes of data online. The data includes names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, and usernames and passwords for some 36 million accounts, as well as details about the sexual preferences of account holders and the kinds of partners they were seeking. Among the emails released were about 15,000 with .mil and .gov domains, though it's not clear if the accounts are legitimate government email accounts or if the people who used them to open the Ashley Madison accounts are the real government workers who own the accounts. The data released also contained millions of credit card transaction details going back to 2007. Although the data didn't include full credit card numbers, it did include names and addresses for people who owned the cards. It's not clear how much of the data released is valid. Ashley Madison didn't require real names and addresses for members, so members supplied bogus email addresses and other data in some cases. But the payment card transactions would have required real names if the buyers used real credit cards and not prepaid cards that offer anonymity.
And here's what happened. All right. So, firstly, we're talking about the disclosure, the release of millions of names of married people who clearly were prepared to cheat on their partners. And what happened was that there was a supplementary website unrelated to the hack that went online that basically said, we have the data from that release of information. Just type in a name, and we will tell you whether that name, was part of that. Was part of the Ashley Madison, website, the app. And that's what it did. It destroyed, thousands of people's marriages, and some people, it destroyed their lives. And there's a we're going to watch a video that happened to this particular person.
A pastor, a husband, father of two, a seminary professor with a sense of humor.
My dad was a great man. He was a great man with struggles. My dad reached a point of such hopelessness and despair that he took his own life.
It was just 6 days after hackers exposed the names of millions signed up for Ashley Madison, a website for people seeking affairs. Gibson's name was on the list.
I came home from work and I began to notice clues around the house that things were not what they were supposed to be. Eventually, I discovered him, and it was a moment that life doesn't prepare you for. How do you tell your kids that their dad is gone and that he took his own life?
I think that the hardest thing for me to deal with was that he honestly doubted the fact that I would love him enough.
In his suicide note, Gibson wrote about being on Ashley Madison. Do you mind sharing a little bit of what he said in that note?
He talked about his depression. He talked about having his name on there, and he said he was just very, very sorry. He poured his life into other people, but somehow or other he couldn't extend that to himself.
Facing the harsh reality of loss, Christy says there's also forgiveness.
I still believe that it could have been fixed. It could have been healed in our life.
Do you think that he worried that if this came out, that he could potentially lose his job?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And there's brokenness in every single one of us. We all have things that we struggle with. But it wasn't so bad that we wouldn't have forgiven it. And so many people have said that to us. But for John, it carried with him such a shame. And he couldn't see that.
With a hack that left 32 million names of potential adulterers exposed, Christy has a message for communities grappling with infidelity.
These were real people with real families and real pain. It's not funny. It's not a source for salacious gossip.
What would you tell those people who are potentially contemplating the worst?
Don't underestimate the power of love. Nothing is worth the loss of a father and a husband and a friend. It just didn't merit it. It didn't merit it at all.
So, if you're paying attention there, and I'm going to stop the tonight's lecture at this point. There's just a couple more slides about how to avoid data breaches and what have you, which you're welcome to take a look at, including another video on basically protecting data. But I'm going to stop it here because this is a really, really important point to make, because we're talking about data breaches that, the Reverend who killed himself, he's not the only one. There were a lot of people who killed themselves, committed suicide because they were just monumentally embarrassed, ashamed, and what have you, that this kind of data got into the public, public sphere. And again, the hackers, the group that did this, weren't looking for money, because trust me, they would have gotten a lot of money by using this for the purposes of ransomware. There isn't anybody on that list who probably wouldn't have paid God knows how much to keep their privacy intact. What their purpose is for the site itself to come down because they believed it was immoral, right? They actually thought that, in a perfectly legitimate view for them to take, is that, this is an immoral activity. It's got to stop. Ashley Madison, you have to take it down. And if you don't take it down, we're going to basically destroy the people on your site. So anyway, there we go. So that's where we'll leave it tonight. But that's a really, really good, illustration of the kinds of damage that data breaches can inflict. All right. Okay, so we're going to now go to the breakout rooms. You guys know the process here. Again, 5 groups for the 5 questions that I posted on Moodle yesterday. I'll give you 20 minutes tonight because it's a little more comprehensive questions and answers than last day, which we only did for 15 minutes. So I'll give you everybody 20 minutes and put you into breakout rooms, and I will be back to you in 15 minutes just to say there's 5 minutes to go. Mm-hmm. Is what?